So it was a net positive for the industry. HTS-level substitution is the eighth wonder of the trade compliance world, is what I say. But we didn't cross the finish line for everyone, or the goal line for everyone.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Folks, we're in for another show of Simply Trade Podcast, and it is going to be a good show today because we're going to get to talk about some things that are be a bit more on the advanced side of things. There's been some recent news in the being published talking about the China tariffs and a few other things. We know it's an election year. We know different things are going on. What different economic struggles and whatnot. We're going to get into a topic today. We're getting the privilege again to interview Tony Nogueras. I would just say, folks, this is one that if you're looking at Drawback services, and this is not an ad or anything like that, but I would say you at least need to check out Alliance and with what they're offering and whenever. They've got a great group of people. They know their stuff, and anyway, worth checking out. We're going to get to talk today about the new announcements, I guess. There's been a lot of things hitting LinkedIn and different programs and different podcasts, different webinars on the recent announcement about the 301 tariffs.
Well, that we just covered, and it's a bit interesting how this has evolved under the Biden administration, because there was talk initially that maybe there would be more exclusions granted. We want to try to maybe soften the trade war with China, talk of potentially rolling it back. And this is early in the Biden administration. And I know there were some proverbial trial balloons that were floated, and there was such pushback, obviously from the likely quarters, union, labor, but pretty much across both sides of the aisle. We don't have a lot of bipartisanship these days, but there was really pushback from both sides of the aisle to keep those tariffs in place. And that's essentially what happened. And ironically, now the Biden administration has gone a bit 180 and is looking to, they're not looking to, they already announced it, that there's going to be an increase in tariffs on certain categories of goods. More strategic goods, so to speak, areas that we want to make sure that we maintain a certain amount of economic independence and so forth, and making sure that we have a competitive and balanced playing field. So that's the latest. Now, certain punitive tariffs comparing 232, which are on steel and aluminum, against 301, 232 tariffs are not drawback eligible. It really has to be challenged at this point in court. There's maybe an avenue to challenge the drawback eligibility of those tariffs. But 301 tariffs has been drawback eligible since their initial implementation. And that's where those folks that are in the tariff mitigation business, be it foreign trade zone operators, bonded warehouses, this is our proverbial 15-minute thing that's been going on now for 5 years. As I like to say, we've gone from the basement to the boardroom, right? When your average duty rates were somewhere between, the United States for the most part is a very open market. We have nimble barriers to trade along with most of the developed world. And so you're looking at duty rates somewhere on average between 2 and 5%. That's significant, and certainly drawback was front and center depending on the industry. Obviously in those industries where you have higher rates of duty, but, throwing 25% tariffs on $500 billion in imports, with our primary trading partner on the import side of the equation, that sent folks scrambling for ways to mitigate tariffs all the way up to the boardroom. And, once again, we sort of rockstar status since that point. And You mentioned we wanted to sort of cover some of the more advanced topics as it relates to drawback and tariff mitigation strategies. And, obviously companies have a variety of options to choose from. Altering your supply chain so that you're sourcing from places other than China, moving operations, manufacturing operations back to the United States. That doesn't, companies can't turn on a dime when it comes to adjusting their supply chain. So, companies obviously are taking a very hard look at tariff mitigation strategies. Each one has its own comparative advantages and disadvantages. And that's where a company just needs to assess all the options, take a hard look at the supply chain, and determine which of those tariff mitigation strategies is the most appropriate. And in some cases, you layer them. In some cases, a lot of our clients are operating foreign trade zones and duty drawback programs simultaneously. Each one of those provides its own, I think, advantages over the other. And so it's important to really understand some of those nuances and dynamics. If I can sort of continue with that line of thought, Andy, I think there's one area specifically where the modernized drawback regime provides a significant advantage over other tariff mitigation strategies.
And going there, I know where you're going with this, and I would love it. This is one of the things. Let me stop for a second. Folks, if you're in the compliance area, this is a show that you need to, like I said, make sure that you inform those above you in that the opportunity here for the bottom line. This comes into some strategic planning and thinking. There's some general assumptions. Hey, I just got to move away from China, or I've got to look at other sources, which is fine. There's other factors that come into play as far as your source, because one of the other things is port congestion. If there's problems in that, you still have to get your goods in. But on the other side of the coin, if everything's flowing, there's some things here that from a cash flow perspective, and your bottom line that, Tony, I think what you're going to hit on is something that they need to be aware of.
Yeah, exactly. I mentioned foreign trade zones. In many cases, companies are looking at comparing and contrasting the various tariff mitigation strategies. When it comes to zone, historically, if a company had an inverted tariff benefit, right, then that's an advantage over duty drawback. So if you're manufacturing an automobile in a zone and then you enter it into commerce in the United States and it's free of duty, then all of your tariffs just went away. Nobody can compete with that. Similarly, under the new HTS drawback regime, so this is what we call the modernized drawback statutory and regulatory structure, which was fully implemented in 2018. This was a game changer, okay, in the world of drawback, in that we significantly liberalized the substitution provision of the duty drawback statute. Well, what's substitution? Well, drawback involves the import and the re-export of material. And when you re-export out of the United States, you get a refund of the duties, tariffs, fee. In some cases, we're talking duties. If we're talking alcohol, tobacco, and refined petroleum products, we're talking excise tax, all of which are eligible via the drawback program, assuming they're paid at the time of entry to Customs and Border Protection. Okay. Well, under the old regime, let's use a simple example here. If we're exporting a pair of Ray-Ban sunglasses, and this is prior to 2018, our method of matching under the substitution provision, we wouldn't have to go back through inventory and find the exact same pair of sunglasses on the import side of the equation. We could select any pair of Ray-Ban 123s that was within 3 years of the export date and just pick that one to file drawback against. Okay, pretty simple concept. Part number level matching. If we were exporting orange juice and we exported Florida orange juice and we imported Brazilian, I'm talking about under the old rule, we have to make sure that they met the same specification. We could still substitute. It was just at a more granular level. It had to be grade A for grade A. If you're talking electronic components, part number for part number. So let's fast forward the movie under the current regime. Now we can disregard grade, specification, and even part number. All of that falls by the wayside, and we can match imports and exports at the 8th digit of the harmonized tariff schedule number. Pretty simple concept. So now, but the devil's in the details. So now,
and to that point right there is again, for those that may not be necessarily up to speed on the minutia on this, I would say that this is one of those that basically in general is that you can import product from a country and you're exporting, you're selling similar product. It's under the same classification. Doesn't have to be the same part number. And you can substitute that basically. So it widens the eligibility of what you can claim in a duty drawback. Is that a pretty safe nutshell?
100%. You knocked it out of the park there, Andy.
I think a really good example recently was with Volvo importing Chinese electric cars under the Volvo brand and exporting the very similar SUV out to Europe, but it was not electric, and that's how they're getting away with not having to pay duties for electric vehicles coming in from China. I believe I saw that or we talked about that in the past.
Yeah. Let me just clarify this point. Conceptually, you're correct, Llewellyn, but the devil's in the details. Remember, the classification has to be the same. If you have an internal combustion engine, that's going to be a different HTS. So what's happening is, it's a common business model for the automobile manufacturers. They make a particular model of an EV, let's say somewhere in the South, BMW, it's in South Carolina. Everybody knows Mercedes has plants in Alabama and so forth. These companies are importing certain models that are being manufactured in Germany or Japan that they import for domestic sale in the United States. They make different EV models in their domestic plants in the U.S. and they export those. And they supply those EV models from the United States, fall under the same 8-digit classification, and that's how they're able to offset the duty. So I just want to make that point. Keep in mind, it's got to be HTS to HTS at the 8th digit. But here's where it gets interesting. And here's where I like to refer HTS-level to the HTS-level substitution as the 8th wonder of the trade compliance world. Let's say you have an electronics distribution company, and we've worked with quite a few. These are large billion-dollar organizations that are importing from a variety of different origination points. Of course, let's take a semiconductor company. They're importing from their plants in Japan. And what is the regular rate of duty on semiconductors? It's 0. Okay, they have plants, let's say in Indonesia or Malaysia. They also have plants in China. Now, all of these semiconductors or integrated circuits have different part numbers because they have different applications. Some of the applications are in automotive, other in household appliances, across the board in various technology applications. All of these ICs share, or a portion of them, share the same HTS. So you're importing, let's recap. You're importing from Japan duty-free, you're importing from Malaysia duty-free, and then you're importing from China at a 25% rate of duty. Okay? All of these goods enter your inventory and your distribution facility in the United States. You undergo some repackaging operations, but you're essentially exporting the ICs in the same condition. These are electronic distributors. Some of the ICs that are being exported from the United States originated in where? Japan, Malaysia. There's no duty associated with them. They are free of duty. You can use those exports of duty-free or even domestic. So let's say that you had a domestic U.S. plant producing integrated circuits. They share the same HTS as that which you're importing from China. All of the export volume that leaves the United States can be used to offset the China tariffs. So if you were sourcing from multiple locations and you were, let's say, export rich of that HTS from the U.S., because you're exporting duty-free, you're exporting domestic, you may be able to offset 100% of the China tariff that you're paying. The other tariff mitigation strategies whether it's a foreign trade zone or a bonded warehouse, cannot offer that type of advantage. Because when you enter goods into the United States from foreign trade zone for domestic consumption, you're paying the duty, right? You're just deferring the duty, but you're going to have to pay it when you enter goods into the commerce of the United States. So really, you're only saving in a foreign trade zone in the scenario that I just outlined is you import from China, you're deferring the duty, and then you export goods from China, right? And you never pay the duty. Under the drawback scenario, you're exporting goods that originated in Indonesia, in Japan, and you're using those export items to offset the entirety of your China tariff, even for those ICs that you're selling in the United States. So for certain HTSs, for these electronic distributors, we're able to offset 100% of their China tariff. That's a distinct strategic advantage. Now, if you're just importing from China and you just re-export, that scenario doesn't apply.
Well, and that's where and to that point, let me jump in here is that, again, we're getting into a few things here that it can get a little confusing. Folks, the objective here, what you need to be looking at is picking out, there are some things here that you have an opportunity to improve your bottom line and with your current supply chains and what's going on. But you need an expert in there. This is where folks like, Tony's company, and there's several other companies out there that do duty drawback. Get an expert, get them to come in and sit down and talk with you to see if you have the opportunity, if you are drawback eligible, and see how you can incorporate these processes into your supply chain, if you will, and your accounting processes and inventory processes, because that's one of the things right there that if you're going to do something, check it out and you can go from there. So, Tony, with that, I guess this is one of those where what I love hearing is that you're importing from multiple locations, paying those duties. There's some of them, obviously, you said that you have some that are on the China tariffs. Basically, it's like bringing in some goods out of China as one of your sources. You have the extra 25% duty on it with the 301s, but you're selling and you could be exporting, let's say, goods that are manufactured in Brazil. If it was the same HTS, you're able to do a duty drawback off of the Chinese goods and keep going. And so that right there is like whatever item, I guess, that has the highest duty rate. When you're exporting, you're able to substitute that and claim that. So that's the beauty of that.
Correct. Yeah, let's say I'm importing ICs from Germany or some other product from Germany, let's say that's at the regular rate of duty of 3%. But I also have different part number, same HTS from China at 25%. So anytime you make an importation that's duty paid, it's like making a deposit into your drawback bank account. Okay. In order to make a withdrawal, you need to have merchandise that shares the same HTS. It doesn't matter the source where that export originated from. Doesn't matter. All that matters is it shares the same HTS. The point that you just made, Andy, which was a very astute point, and that is, well, what if I have imports in my bank, some of which that are dutiable at 3 or 5%, and others that are dutiable at 25%, they share the same HTS. Under the substitution provision, we want to exhaust the 25% imports first. So we're going to chew those up on a high to low basis. And so the overall point here is that in order to maximize the program, you really need to dive deep into the analytics side of the equation. I haven't even ventured into some of the other rulemaking that even places a higher premium on advanced type of analytics. I'll give you one example of that. So here are some of the tripping points. Andy, you said you wanted advanced topics. Well, for better or worse, at the risk of speaking Greek and losing our audience here, I'm going to wade into some of the nuances. Now, HTS-level substitution, what a great concept. There were some members of Congress that said, well, wait a second here. we have HTSs that are very broad, that are catch-all baskets, basket provisions that begin with the term other at the 8 digits. Doesn't have a specific product description, right? And there was some concern in Congress that it was created too much of an advantage. They're giving away the store. We want to make sure at least similar merchandise is being exported. And so consequently, there was a last-minute compromise. And the compromise essentially was, okay, if your classification falls into this catch-all basket, other at the 8th digit, then you got to jump to the 10th digit. And if we have a statistical breakout at the 10th digit, you can still claim under the substitution provision. And by the way, this only applies to what we call pass-through drawback. There's manufacturing drawback. That's a different category where you're importing raw materials, you make a new and different article of commerce, and you export the finished product. What we're talking about here is you import and export at the same level of production in essence. And so the compromise was at the 10th digit, you can claim HTS-level substitution. Well, we all know we have classifications that never get to a stat breakout. They're other. So what happens there? If you're other, then you cannot file under HTS-level substitution. Your alternative is to go back to the part number level matching and file under what we call J1 or direct identification drawback, which has a much higher compliance bar. And so unfortunately, there was a proverbial list of winners and losers that came out of the statutory change in 2018. And if you're many of your classifications begin with other at the 8th and 10th, your only alternative now is to file under direct identification drawback. So there were quite a few companies that fell into that trap. And so this HTS-level substitution was not a net positive. I mean, it was a net positive. For certain specific companies, it was a net negative, right? Now, here's the good news. We're trying to clean that up with the statutory change, all right? So we're going back to, we moved the ball to the red zone, as we like to say, in football. So it was a net positive for the industry. HTS-level substitution is the eighth wonder of the trade compliance world, as I like to say. But we didn't cross the finish line for everyone, or the goal line for everyone. So the industry, a coalition of members of the industry got together. We have committees and so forth. This process is being driven in Washington, D.C. There are current lobbying efforts in place that will essentially remove this restriction so that now even classifications that begin with other at the 8th and 10th will be drawback eligible under the substitution provision. Now, we all know it's what we like to call silly season in Washington, D.C. for election year. Yeah. And those waters were just muddied a bit by, we won't get into politics here, but we all understand the dynamic of what happened recently out of New York. And so there's even less cooperation, if that was even possible, on bipartisan measures. So we're probably at a bit of a standstill, even when it comes to bipartisan trade legislation. I know there's some legislation. So the question is there a legislative vehicle between now and November, whether it's renewal of GSP or other potential vehicle, where we can attach this particular technical change to that would really create probably hundreds of millions of dollars in additional refunds to the trade community. We shall see. Probably our best shot, I'm guessing. In many instances, they have the proverbial lame duck session of Congress, which is subsequent to the November election and prior to the swearing in of the new Congress. And in many instances, there's a huge push to, move legislation through that has been sitting on the sideline as we waited for the election result. So maybe during the lame duck session, we're all cautiously optimistic.
With that, let me ask this question then, is that of the different opportunities here, Tony, do you have some examples of what some companies have been able to do as far as their recouping? I mean, you obviously have some great customers, but some examples of they went through the efforts of getting set up to do drawback, which is not something you just flip a switch and do. You've got to do certain setups and get ready for it, in accounting things and reports and all that. But to that point, what's been the results of it for some of these companies that you've seen?
Okay. Well, so now we're delving into a bit of the process. And let me just say that with any company that approaches us and wants to sort of assess and evaluate this opportunity and whether it's viable, because as we like to say, the proverbial juice has to be worth the squeeze, right? It's not that you necessarily have to set up additional processes and procedures. In most instances, a company's existing record retention should be able to support its drawback claim. Now, when we're talking 25% tariffs, what we've seen out there, when the average tariff rate is between 2 and 5%, in most instances, the tail's not going to wag at all, right? The company's not going to alter its supply chain in order to maximize drawback recovery. But now you're talking about the regular rate of duty plus 25%. So we've seen companies in certain instances alter their supply chain and their logistics model and their business model in order to maximize recovery. It's that impactful. And I'll give you an example here. One of the big winners, I talked about the proverbial list of winners and losers anytime you have a statutory change, right? It was considered, among industry experts and insiders, you try to assess and evaluate who that list of proverbial winners and losers are. For us, why? Because we want to target them as potential accounts. And number one on the list of winners was going to be the alcohol industry. Well, why is that? HTS-level substitution. Under the old rules, if you were exporting, let's say some vodka that you imported, Smirnoff that you imported from your manufacturing facilities in Europe, and you exported to Latin America, then you could claim Smirnoff for Smirnoff. It had to be specific, essentially, to the brand, right? No longer the case with HTS-level substitution.
So with that, you could have like domestic produced vodka and still import your Smirnoff, if you will.
Correct.
And then sell your domestic vodka, but still do a duty drawback on the Russian, or I'll say Russian, or whatever Smirnoff is now manufactured from.
Correct. So, yeah, for example, let's say that Diageo or Brown and Forman went out and purchased Tito's. And Tito's is exported all over the world. So all of a sudden they're export rich, right? And they're importing Ciroc, which is produced in France from grapes. And I'm sure there's substantial, because it's a very popular high-end vodka. There's only one classification for vodka. There's a slight difference as it relates to the volume. But for the most part, pardon me, not volume, but value, I misspoke there. But for the most part, there's one classification for vodka. So what does that mean? All imports of vodka in the United States, you're paying excise tax at the time of importation. If you have offsetting exports, even if they were produced in the United States as the Tito's is, you can use that to offset the excise tax associated with the Ciroc that you're paying at the time of entry. Okay.
That is huge.
Huge. Let's give another example. Molson Coors. Right now, I'm not speaking out of turn here. We have non-disclosure agreements with all our clients. These are not clients, but I know their business model. Okay. But importing Molson from Canada, pay your excise tax at the time of importation, and now you have the Miller Lite that you're distributing from the United States to the Caribbean. Well, because the Miller Lite's not being consumed in the United States, there's no excise tax that you have to pay. That's essentially a sin tax. right? So if you're exporting the Miller Lite, you never pay the excise tax. So that's customs considers that to be having your cake and eating it too, or quote, double drawback. So, and in fact, anytime the law changed, customs gets the opportunity to rewrite the regulations. Sometimes it's a collaborative effort, but their word is law in the universe until you do what? Take them to court or go back to Congress and change the law. So we know that Congress grants customs broad deference to administer these programs, right? And customs, when they published the regulations, they finally did some of the math on this, and there were people in the Treasury that were not all too keen when they discovered that this was not going to be revenue neutral, that the alcohol industry was going to be able to bypass one of those excise taxes. And so guess what? They included a regulatory provision that said, by the way, if it's regular duty, there's nothing we can do about that. But we think there should be a special rule about excise tax. And so we're going to say that that's not eligible under J2. So they tried to undermine the alcohol industry, the big winners. And so, a lot of these more, some of these more controversial points that don't rise to the level of importance, once again, the juice is not worth the squeeze, then customs can say no for many years because there's just not enough money in it to litigate it. But when you're talking excise tax in the alcohol industry, they were slapped with litigation almost on day one. And they lost badly the Court of International Trade. So that battle has been won. Of course, customs has the government has unlimited resources, and they lost on appeal as well.
Any other industries in particular that have really benefited in the electronics, a big one?
Electronics, because they're all sourcing from multiple origination points. So HTS-level substitution was the real boom for that. But even in situations where maybe a company is just importing from China and the flexibility associated with HTS-level substitution really lowered the compliance part of it. But it did introduce some other rulemaking. And let's go back to the example of the sunglasses. So if you're exporting Ray-Ban 123, under the old regime, you have to match against an imported pair of Ray-Ban. Now you can export Ray-Ban 123 and match against an imported pair of Oakley. Why? Because they share the same classification at the 8th digit. But what about if we go down, the type of sunglasses, Andy, that you probably wear that you pick up down at 7-Eleven. Sorry, I think that was maybe a call for there. That was a gratuitous shot there at your fashion sense. But let's say that you're importing, the cheaper sunglasses that you buy down at the local 7-Eleven, and we're exporting those. Well, would they share the same HTS? There's such a disparity in value. That can't be right.
But the commodity is still the same. I mean, ultimately, it's sunglasses, whether it's a 50-cent item or a $500 set item, right?
Correct. But here's where the devil in the details. It's a lesser of two values that you get drawback on. Okay? So if you export the pair of sunglasses that has a wholesale value of $5, and you're importing the Ray-Bans that have a wholesale value of $30, and it's 3.2%, or actually, I think 2.1 or 2.3% is the actual rate of duty, you only get the lesser of the two. So consequently, what does that mean when you're constructing your drawback claim? What that means is you better pay close attention to your value matching. If you're export rich, you don't want to match a low value export with a high value import because you're going to leave money on the table. And so we've seen with existing drawback programs that we inherit, the first thing we do is conduct a detailed assessment, right? And we're going to look back in time because drawback has a retroactive feature. You have 5 years of history that's on the table. You have 5 years from the date of import to file a drawback claim. So if you're a new program, you could be sitting on a substantial windfall of historical recovery. So that's the good news. Year one, you could be sitting on millions of dollars that's going to hit your bottom line.
Folks, this is one of those where if you've not been doing drawbacks and you're at a point where, because the economy has been sucking wind at different times and whatnot, you may be looking for something to help, take you over the top here for a while or whatever. As Tony just said, you're able to go back 5 years. You may be sitting on a gold mine that don't even realize that. So again, you need to get your experts in, because, drawback is not something that you just willy-nilly look at. You've got to do some work on it, but it is well worth the investment that you have to put in your time, your people's time, your reports, and getting that information out to investigate that with the right people and get yourself set up to where you can start drawing back, some dollars to your bottom line.
Yeah. And if I can highlight that point, so if you have an existing program, step one, look under the hood of the historical recovery. We want to make sure that you maximize your recovery with proper value matching, because that's a tripwire in this process. And we've discovered companies leaving millions of dollars, and you have the opportunity to go back and amend claims for file supplemental filings. You can rework these claims if there was money that was left on the table. Also, we've run into companies that filed non-compliant filings. Okay. For example, if you're exporting to Canada, Mexico, you can't claim that under J2. If you're exporting to Chile, same. So if some of those exports snuck into your unused substitution claim, that was non-compliant. So step number one is we want to assess the path with the recovery that was left on the table. Secondarily, is there any compliance exposure? If you're a new filer, then step one is let's try to put a number on this opportunity to make sure minimally that it's viable. How do we go about doing that? Well, if you don't have ACE access, that's step one. We go grab some ACE reporting, set you up in the ACE portal, run some very specific reports, and we will conduct an HTS-level assessment, because you don't have part number level detail in ACE. So we can't evaluate manufacturing drawback in ACE or J1 in ACE because there's not part number level detail. But we can certainly look at the HTS level to see what matches at a very broad classification level. And depending on what we see there, right out of the gate, we might have millions of dollars in potential recovery. And then the next step is let's move into the implementation phase. Let's start setting up our procedures. How are we going to gather the documents and data in order to maximize the program? So it's really just a project. And the project is divided into two phases. Phase number one is let's look at the path and maximize it, and then implement procedures so that on a go forward, we're filing drawback regularly on a quarterly or monthly basis, or whatever really is most advantageous. And so it's an ongoing process. And with that, I will turn it back over to you. So the big takeaway is look under the hood, conduct an assessment, even if you have an existing program, and certainly if you have potential for a new program. And, if we run into a situation where we think the zone is really the most advantageous strategic approach, we're going to say, look, implement a zone instead of drawback. It makes the most sense because of these reasons. So we'll try to be very objective about this analysis.
Well, and even if you're implementing a zone, you still have the opportunity to utilize drawback as a stepping stone to capitalize on some of the past opportunities while you're looking at it in the zone from this point on going forward. And again, that a zone takes quite a while to get up and running. All that to say, Tony, I got to tell you, we could keep going, but obviously for sake of time, we need to wrap up here. Folks, we're going to have Tony back to talk through about some of the basics of, okay, you've piqued my interest. We're actually now going to go back to Drawback 101 and go through a little bit more of the basics of how to set this up, who to talk to and all that. But basically right now, if you're in the compliance area, you need to make sure you reach out to your CFO or your finance directors and all that and build an alliance there and a relationship, as well as talk through this, because that's the avenue that you need to go with to try and see, all right, you need to at least invest in bringing in an expert to initially do an assessment. Are you drawback eligible? Go through those things. And secondarily to that, then it'll be a multi-divisional type thing to look at, harness that for longer term, to maximize your efforts. So Tony, man, I love talking with you. You're going to forget more than I'm going to get to learn, buddy.
Well, I appreciate that. And I like how you use the term alliance there, that it's an alliance. So it's a collaborative effort. We'll leave it on that point. And I really appreciate the opportunity to address your audience. It's always a distinct pleasure on my side of the equation as well. And you just say the word, we'd love to come back on and continue the dialogue with you and your audience. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Definitely. Lalo, we're going to have Tony's contact information and information there and about the company if they're interested in that, along with if there are any questions. Folks can, send us notes, send us comments or whatever, share this, do whatever, but we appreciate their support because we are growing as a show thanks to the listenership here.
Yeah, and thank you. We will. So Tony will have your contact information as well as Alliance as well, and so people should be able to scroll down and view your information. But for everybody that's listening, you should just check our show notes and you'll find that information on there.
And thank you, sir. And and Lalo, hope you all have a great day and look forward to the next show.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.